Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us. Welcome to another episode of Career Soul. Today, I have the privilege of sitting down with David Bovis. It's a real pleasure for me because I've known David at his work for the past few years, and I've been lucky enough to have attended several of his talks, which have been very inspiring, not just for me, but for many other people. David has combined his over 40 years of experience in continuous improvement, lean consultancy, and with the principles of neuroscience. And he has created BTFA, a framework that we are going to touch upon today. And he helps leaders fix the missing piece, as he puts it, in the business transformation. So please join me in welcoming David Bovis. David, thank you very much for accepting my invitation, and welcome to Career Soul.
Hi, Mina. No, thanks for having me. It's great. It's a pleasure to be invited along. So, yeah, happy to be here.
Thank you. David has kindly prepared some slides for us to go through how we can use the neuroscience principles to break habits or create new ones. So I cannot wait to get started. And I have prepared some questions that I would like to ask you. And I'm sure that people who are joining us will come along with questions. So let's kick off and get it from there.
Super. Thanks ever so much. Yeah, brilliant. Right. Okay, let's get the screen shared then. I guess so. The assumption is that people are here because, you know, you're moving towards the idea that we've all got a brain. We've got a 40% genetic jump off point, you know, and from that point on, everything else that we do in life builds the rest of the brain. So we go through these early years imprinting phases, as psychologists call it, and the brain's growing from 0 years old to 3 years old from about 25% neural mass to 85% neural mass. It peaks out in adolescence and then falls back about into adulthood. And I don't think I'm here to convince anybody that neuroscience is important. I think we all agree that, you know, that we are the output of our brain function. So hopefully, if we can accept that, then what I say from this point forward should make a lot of sense. Great. Assuming that works for everybody, then, you know, the big picture stuff is always quite interesting. The brain's processing 11.8 million bits of sensory data per second, and that's all being done pre-consciously, which explains a little bit that old thing that I think most people are aware now, that, you know, 2% to 3% of our body mass is our brain matter, but it uses about 20% of all the energy that we generate as a human being. And it's in that pre-conscious processing that we form our habits. But I want to just quickly say and put a caveat at the front end. Habits can change in a millisecond. John Medina, in his brilliant book Brain Rules, writes about seeing the glint of moonlight off a knife point when he was asleep in bed one night, where somebody broke into his house and robbed him. And from that point forward, his brain never forgot to lock the windows and doors ever again. So, you know, you can form habits and change old habits very, very quickly, depending on how strong the emotional trigger is. And the fact is, the brain's designed to protect how quickly it consumes the glucose energy it's got access to from our food and carbohydrates. And so we're biologically predisposed to try and stick with what we know. Okay, so that's where habits come into it. So hopefully that makes sense. So the first thing is, let's just, I mean, like I said, I'm not going to labour the point, and I'm not going to spend hours going through this presentation in detail, because we've only got half an hour and we want to get to some discussion and questions. But just so we've sort of brushed across the surface, this is, if you're looking down on top of a brain, you know, the bit at the top would be where the prefrontal cortex is. So this bit, and we're looking down here, right? So the substantia nigra, the bit at the bottom, the two grey areas are at the back, and that's what produces dopamine, which is one of many, many neurotransmitters. And so here you can see that if we think about habits, what is kind of accepted is that there's a cue, something happens. That can be environmental, it can be something you see or something you hear, like a tiger in the grass historically that you want to defend yourself against, or it can be an internal trigger, it can be your own thinking processes. And I know, Mina, in your introduction to this over the last week or so on different social media platforms, you've mentioned about, you know, the barriers that how we get in our own way, and it's those thinking loops that I'll come back to at the end that are actually sort of present a lot of the barriers and the dissatisfaction with life that people experience. But it's all brain function. Brain function's malleable, so it means we can do something about it. And that's the important message here, I think, is that if we've got brain patterns and outputs from our brain function that don't serve us, we don't have to just live with that. There's something we can do about it, and that's the good news story. But if we go through the process, you've got the cue, you've got the routine, and you've got the reward. So the cue is that environmental trigger, the caudate nucleus. So I'm not going to go through, like I said, too much detail, because there's so many silly words with neuroscience. You've got, oh, look at that, caudate nucleus and putamen and globus pallidus. And then you group a couple of them together and call it the striatum, and you group all four of them together and call it basal ganglia. And, you know, it's a whole new world of language to try and get used to, and it's really complicated. But just, I wanted to show it and put it on screen just so you know that there is science behind this. Neuroscientists have gone into these parts of the brain and found out what they do, to a large extent at least. So the routine is, once you get that caudate nucleus, it's the inbound sensory signal receiver from your eyes and your ears and your senses. That's then triggers the rest of the process. So the routine is that the putamen runs the habitual behavior automatically. If you've got a wiring and firing pattern that's been established in response to something, that's what gets triggered by the putamen. And I hope most people know that if you've got neurons in your brain, the more thickly myelinated they are, it means the thicker the insulation sheath is around the axon, the easier it is for them to fire. And the more they've been used, the stronger that is, which is Hebb's rule. And we'll go back to that in a minute. And then there's the reward. There's the bit where the substantia nigra releases the dopamine. Dopamine is linked to motivation and being driven to do things. And that hits the nucleus accumbens, which is the red bits, which fires it back forward through the process. So the interesting bit here is that dopamine gets released even when we just think about something being good for us or doing something, rather than just the act itself. And that's an important point that will come out more clearly in a little while. Okay, so that's the situation. That's exactly what happens in all brains. It all works the same way to different levels, varying degrees, depending on how people have been formed by life, but the process is the same. And when this loop is running, you don't necessarily need the prefrontal cortex to cut in, which is where, you know, it's highly energy intensive and we have to put a bit more effort into thinking. So if you accept all that, and now we're looking at the side of the brain, so what we're just looking at on top is now sideways, and you've got the bit of the prefrontal cortex. You might have heard of Daniel Kahneman, Thinking Fast and Slow. Fantastic way of framing this stuff. And it's really what you see there is this the pre-conscious, subconscious brain and all of that work that's going on at that 11.8 million bits of data per second is happening really quickly. It's automatic. It's very energy efficient. It never gets tired. It's always on high alert. You know, if you hear a noise in your house that you don't expect when you're asleep, you wake up. It's because your brain's always active. But the prefrontal cortex, it can go offline. It gets easily fatigued because it uses a lot of energy. But it's also very slow. It's rational and goal directed. And that's the bit we rely on to have a conscious conversation like this. And what reaches it is what we've been primed for by life in the past. So the one last thing there, which is red at the bottom on this slide, is that cortisol, which is the stress hormone, the hormone when it's in your body, neurotransmitter when it's in your brain, same chemicals, that actually suppresses the amount of glucose energy that can reach and power the prefrontal cortex, the rational thinking part. So if you're stressed, you're not going to be able to think as logically as you would if you're relaxed, and that's just biology. Okay, so do jump in if you want to clarify anything. I know I'm whizzing through this quickly, but like I said, that's a little bit about neuroscience, just to give you the sense that, you know, there's science behind it, really. And I think this goes in line with the BTFA model. If you believe something because you've got the science to back it up, you're more likely to work with it than you are if it's subjective or ambiguous. So at this point, we're trying to shift beliefs about the fact that there's a brain mechanism at work here, and it's something we can all work with. So you can't, well, he says you can't delete a habit, but you can, if you don't use a neuron for long enough that's been established in the past, it will eventually die away and be replaced with a different neural pattern. So you can, but it's not going to be quick. But you can overwrite it with different movements of neurons and dendrites on neurons, and you can disrupt it and reroute it if you sort of interrupt the automatic thinking pattern. So just to prove that point, I just want to run this little video quickly, because it actually shows you what neurons look like in vitro rather than in vivo lab situation, and you can see the time lapse going along at the bottom there, 38, 40 hours. So this is a week from progenitor cells, which is like stem cells for brain biology, growing some new neurons and then reaching out and just naturally connecting with each other. So that's without any stimulus other than blue light. And that's the kind of growth that you get. Now that's happening in our brains all the time because of all the stimulus that we get from everything, all those 11.8 billion bits of data. So, you know, you can imagine that the neurons are adapting and reconnecting and growing and making new circuits. And that's essentially the essence of learning, right? If we don't have a new wiring and firing pattern in our brain, what it outputs via our body, our language, you know, or whatever else we do never changes, right? So to change is to change your brain. So how do we do something about this? Well, the first point is that cue bit. You know, it's the on switch. It's the first bit that comes into the brain and then it gets processed and pushed forward. So what you can do is you can remove or alter the cue. Now that we said it is internal or external. So the first thing to do is think about what, you know, externally, we'll use a few examples today, but internally you want to think about your thinking. And I'm going to mention this word metacognition, which means thinking about your thinking. And that's where the real skill comes in. But you can try and change your context. You can try and change your environment, and that, you know, just where you are in the world, to try and interrupt the process. And, you know, just the idea of eating too many bourbon biscuits or something is a good example of that. If you just move them out of sight, out of mind, you know, some of these old sayings exist for a reason. And there have been studies done by Wansink at Cornell, where you can see that, you know, approximately 25% improved ability to avoid eating too much is helped when you change your context and your environment. Same thing if you've got to focus on doing something. If you go and put the phone in another room, you know, every single buzz and beep and little, you know, notification is not going to keep you distracted. So you get a 40% increase in focus. But it's not because you apply your thinking to ignoring the phone, you change your context. So that's the point here. And the key is, you know, well, I mentioned it a minute ago, anticipatory dopamine fires before the routine. So if you say, oh, I'll just have one biscuit, rather than moving them out of the room, you don't ever stop having the second one, because your brain's already given you that reward of dopamine flushing through that system, just on the thought of getting the next one. So that's why it makes it so difficult. So an action you can do here is to think about, what are my most unwanted habits, top 3, 5, 1, whatever it might be. And I try and identify the exact cue with precision, because as soon as you can detail what it is that's triggering you to respond this way, you've got half a chance of removing it out of the situation and changing it. So that's the first step. And what's interesting about this is, you know, I get asked to do talks on neuroscience for all different reasons. So I've been doing some work with the University of Buckingham recently and doing some lectures to some medical students on neurodiverse learning and things like that. And every time I get asked to do something, I dig in and find out what's the neuroscience behind the particular area of interest. And this has been no different, because Mina said she was interested in breaking habits and removing barriers to performance. And what's quite interesting here is that, you know, we're talking about the reward, the dopamine. That's non-negotiable. That's going to happen. You're going to get a dopamine response in your brain. So it's the routine of triggering that you can swap. But you can also keep the same cues and get the same reward, but replace that routine in between. And smoking's a great example to explain that. And I was looking into it this morning, and just the neuroscience behind it is fascinating. It's really good. And there's a couple of things that I've uncovered and learned myself in the process of preparing for this chat. So, you know, when you think about people smoke because they're stressed, but then the smoking process itself becomes stressful. And there's a proven approach that can help you get past that need. And it's 5 deep breaths and some cold water. And it's the fact that if you smoke, you're obviously going to get dopamine release, because what we've just said, you anticipate having the cigarette, and that in itself, the anticipation triggers that dopamine release. But so that's pretty obvious, right? But also, and it's the part that most people miss, is that you're going to get a rapid drop in cortisol and suppression of the stress response, because to be focused on something, i.e. our stress and the thinking that goes with it, you need a chemical in the prefrontal cortex called acetylcholine. But nicotine binds to acetylcholine receptors. So it stops that being able to be active, and it produces a brief but very real calming effect on the nervous system. So the act of smoking itself, if you think about it, it's a slow, controlled, deep breathing exercise, right? Every drag on a cigarette is 4 to 6 seconds controlled inhale, followed by a slow exhale. And that breathing pattern alone, which is completely independent of the nicotine effect on your brain, activates the parasympathetic nervous system via the vagus nerve. So you've got a bunch of nerves that come down your spine from your brain and connect to your body. And part of that, where you're connected through your lungs and the breathing apparatus, is triggering that parasympathetic nervous system. And just by taking those long, deep breaths of breathing the cigarette in, you're activating that, and your heart rate slows within a few seconds. So when we smoke, we think that cigarette is the calming influence, but actually it's the breathing that's doing just as much of the work as the nicotine binding to the acetylcholine receptors and stop it working. So I think, the deep breaths replicate that parasympathetic activation when you do it on purpose without smoking, which is your real physiological calming mechanism. So you do it 5 times and you're going to just click in that autonomic response, right? But on top of that, we said cold water, and cold water does something on top of everything that we've just described, which is if you splash it on your wrists or your face in particular, because of the amount of nerve endings you've got in your skin, you trigger the dive reflex. And that's a hardwired parasympathetic response to rapidly drop the heart rate and cortisol levels. It's abrupt, it's physical, and it's impossible to ignore. It's just a bit like dopamine is going to be released. If you splash water on yourself, your body's designed to respond to that. You can't stop it. So that also interrupts the stress state in a way that's neurologically similar to what nicotine does to the stress response. So it's just using a very different pathway. Rather than using nicotine to bind to acetylcholine receptors, you're triggering a different but very similar response by splashing water on yourself. So, the reason that substitutions fail when people are smoking is usually like, patches or chewing gum or whatever, is the replacement just doesn't deliver enough of the same neurochemical payoff. Okay, so the stress state sort of genuinely reduces when you do this stuff, because that parasympathetic activation is real. It's not a placebo. It's not trying to do something else or distract you. It's literally triggering the same neurological response. So, for heavily addicted smokers, they've still got a real limitation because of the strength of the nicotine impact. The reward, the dopamine reward, and the impact of the nicotine on the uptake receptors. But for people that just smoke casually because they think it helps with stress and it's a habit, then this is going to work if you want to try and change that. So we mentioned it before, Hebb's rule: what fires together wires together, and the more you practice that, I think you can say some studies from some American universities say 66 repetitions, and other people have heard, I even heard somebody link it to chickens' eggs and 21 days gestation periods. No idea. There's lots of different theories about what it means to change a habit and how long it takes. But I personally believe that it's all to do with how much emotion is linked to that. Like I said about John Medina at the beginning. And that's the reason we mention him there, because it says there's no hard and fast rule to this stuff. The only rule is the more emotionally stressful a situation is, the quicker your brain's going to rewire to protect you from the same sorts of stimulus in the future. So that's step 2. Step 3 is, you can change what you're, what's getting rewarded by thinking about it consciously. And this is really interesting, because it's just, if you think about something consciously, you've already interrupted that automatic cycle, because you've engaged a different part of the brain and diverted glucose energy somewhere else. So just labeling something, just thinking about something really changes it. And if we run through that RAIN technique, I think it's, recognize if you simply notice that you've got a craving or a habitual urge is present, and like there's that urge to smoke, or there's that impulse to check my phone, or there's that urge to pick up a biscuit, that recognition actually has a neuroscientific base, because the moment you label that emotion. My wife's going through perimenopause, and estrogen's a neuromodulator. So with her mild OCD tendencies, have just gone through the roof. Some of this stuff is really pertinent to her as well. And we were joking about it. We said you could give your OCD a name, call it Brian or whatever you want to call it, or Jack. Go, oh, there's Brian trying to undo, catch me out again. But the moment you label that emotion or the craving state, even with a single word like that, the activity in the amygdala measurably reduces. So the prefrontal cortex activity increases. You manage to take it away from that automatic response and get more activity going on in the part of the brain where you can control that. And that was demonstrated quite clearly in work by a guy called Matthew Lieberman at UCLA. So yeah, it literally shifts the processing capacity. So you're not trying to suppress the urge, you're just naming it, and that in itself does quite a lot. So that's the first step. And then A is allow in the RAIN model. So that means let the craving exist, without immediately acting on it or fighting it. There's no need to have words in your head, which comes back to the metacognition thing, like I must get rid of this feeling, or this feeling's here, and I'm not going to let it be here. You've got to swap that across to I'm going to let it be here. I can recognise that this is just my brain doing what it does, but that's often quite difficult and counterintuitive for people. But it's different being able to do that than a willpower-based approach. Willpower says suppress and resist, and this RAIN model says don't do either, just observe without engaging. And the reason that works is, from addiction psychology, you've got this phrase called urge surfing, and that means you're just trying to float across the top of the urges and the cravings, but not act on them. And if you do that, then they'll, within about 15 or 20 minutes, the urge will typically rise, peak, and subside. And the problem is, unfortunately, most people either act on that craving before that peak, or they exhaust themselves fighting it. They have that inner dialogue going on, trying, I've got to try and avoid this, I've got to try and think something differently. And that actually triggers an ironic mechanism called the ironic process theory, which means the more you try and think about something, the more cognitively present it becomes. So it's a bit like when people are speaking and they say, don't think of pink elephants, the old trick, and everybody starts thinking of pink elephants, same sort of thing. So then you investigate it, and you've got to turn your attention toward the felt experience of the craving and find out where it's actually happening. Is it in the body? Is it in the back of your wrists or your hands or your stomach, or where does it happen? And again, neurologically, you're then diverting your attention from the prefrontal cortex point of view to something in your body, which is this proprioception type principle. And there's a lot of work that shows that, I think it was Brown University, somebody, who is it? Judson Brewer was the guy's name. They saw smoking cease, at a much higher level when people practice this. So, there's good sort of empirical evidence to back all this up now. And it's usually because that sort of anticipated reward, and the reward value registered by, they call it the orbitofrontal cortex, drops off the charts. You're not getting that dopamine hit to drive you, that motivation to do something. And then the non-identity side of things is recognizing that you're not the craving. The craving is temporary. It's something that happens in you. It's biological. It's natural. It's not you. You don't have to define yourself by it. And so from a neuroscience point of view, we can connect to sort of self-referential processing in the medial prefrontal cortex. That's where we define ourselves with our brain function. So when we fuse with the craving kind of thing and we say, I'm someone who needs this, you got that stronger wiring connection between the craving and yourself. So what you want to try and do is get rid of that and say, well, there's a craving happening, rather than I am the craving, if that makes sense. So yeah, so there's the good models. I mean, I won't go on too much longer because we run out of time, but we've got all of that going on everywhere all the time, and that's what we're really dealing with. So, and there's a few tricks there that you can perhaps apply. Conscious of the fact we are heading towards time here, let me just wrap it all up. I can share these slides if anybody wants to get in touch. I can share them afterwards. But there's a few things you can do, and I won't go through this in detail, but map it, disrupt the cue, install the substitution. There's lots to be said about HRV, and perhaps we can get on another call and do this again and unpack that bit, because that's variable heart rate. And the more relaxed you are, the more variable your heart rate is. You can actually get your Apple Watch and different gadgets now to measure that difference. And because of the connection to the vagus nerve, there's not a direct link, but a proxy link to how active your prefrontal cortex is. So you can actually find out kind of via that as a proxy whether you're stressed and what kind of state your brain's in, which is quite interesting. But just let me play you this little video just to wrap it all up, and then we can take a couple of questions.
40% of everything you do today, you won't decide to do. Your brain already decided. The question isn't whether habits run your life. It's whether you know how to rewrite them. Every habit lives in a loop. A cue triggers it. A routine runs it. And a reward cements it via a dopamine hit that tells your brain, do that again. Here's the thing most people miss. This loop doesn't live in your conscious mind. It lives in the basal ganglia, deep in your brain, a region that doesn't listen to your willpower at all. Each time the loop fires, dopamine floods across the synaptic gap, and the neural pathway gets physically thicker. More myelin, faster signal, more automatic. This is Hebb's rule. Neurons that fire together, wire together. The brain isn't being lazy, it's being ruthlessly efficient. When you try to break a habit with willpower, you're asking your prefrontal cortex, your rational brain, to fight a structure that never tires and never sleeps. Under pressure, cortisol floods the system, and the PFC goes offline first. That's not weakness, that's neuroscience. So what actually works? 3 levers. 1, disrupt the cue before it fires. Change your environment, not your resolve. 2, substitute the routine. Keep the same reward signal, swap out what you do to get it. 3, remap the reward. Use metacognition to devalue the old loop. The old pathway doesn't delete, but it can be outcompeted. The brain changes. We can see it change. We can measure it changing. Neuroplasticity is not a metaphor. You are not stuck with the habits you have. You are stuck with the habits you haven't yet decided to redesign.
Okay, so
40%.
there you go. So there's a lot of thinking patterns that we all fall into the traps of, and these are the things that when we practice metacognition, we can interrupt from that inner trigger point of view. So yeah, when it comes to changing habits and getting out of our own way and getting rid of the barriers to ourselves, I think, you know, it's, if you know there's science behind it, you know there's a mechanism behind it, and you can trust that, then when you think about these processes, and you know that, you know, in week 3 or 4 of changing a habit, you're probably going to feel like you're having a bit of a dip, but there's biology behind that as well, which I could explain if we had more time. But leave you with that thought. You are your brain. So brain change equals you change. And the more you focus on the science and work with that, the better solutions you're going to get and the quicker results.
Amazing. Thank you so much, David. I loved it. And I find it super helpful in a way that it's just so practical, that do this and that. So for example, my takeaway, I believe it would be to first identify the cue of that habit that you would want to change, and then thinking about it is good. Try to identify it, label it. And one thing, for example, that I've tried it before is to stack habits, like do this after that or do this before something else, so it would just stick in. I believe there is a lot to absorb and think about. And one thing that many people struggle with are those internal beliefs. So they are not habits per se, if I may say. So for example, imposter syndrome is something that so many people are struggling with. How does that rewiring work in terms of those internalized beliefs? Is there a way, is there like a exercise or a practice or some steps that one can take to rewire those internalized beliefs?
Yeah, I mean, I think the answer is the same biology applies no matter what you call it, whether it's beliefs, principles, values. You know, these again comes back to this idea of ambiguous words. But and this is why BTFA is the model, right? If we think about, if we've got a belief, whether you like pineapple on pizza or not, or whether, you know, you think any particular political party is good or bad, or which football team is good or bad, they're all beliefs, okay? Or whether you should be honest. So that you might call that more of a value or a principle, but it's still a belief that you need to conduct yourself honestly. And what we have to do first of all is find listen to what we think and assume on autopilot, and just test it and check it. So, work's no place for emotions. Yeah, leave your emotions at the door. That's absolutely ridiculous. It's impossible. You can't. Your brain is designed to use the chemicals that we call emotions, and if it didn't have them and you didn't use them, you wouldn't be able to think or function. So there's no such thing as a logical decision, neurologically speaking, because it all gets routed through elements that have got chemicals that weight things from an emotional perspective. So the first step is to just think about what is it you've been told good looks like in life, and just challenge it. And as soon as you challenge it and start unpacking it and become conscious of it, then you can start connecting to the thought patterns that go with it. So it's like if you think that emotions don't live at work, and to be the boss you've got to be hard-nosed business person and not show any emotion, because that's the inherited belief, the wisdom from the past. If you then challenge that and go, oh, actually that's impossible because science says so, then are you going to carry on banging the table and shouting at your employees to get the work done? Or are you going to go, there's a neurological aspect to this and it's a chemical issue, and if I'm triggering defense responses in people with my behaviors, I'm never going to get the best from them. So then you change your behaviors, right? So it's the same process. What happens neurologically is that even very strongly myelinated, deeply rooted wiring patterns on the cerebral cortex can adapt and change if they're challenged. So it's about becoming aware of the fact that you've inherited some kind of beliefs, and if challenging them is the first step. Understanding that neurogenesis will happen if you challenge them is the second step, and then catching yourself when you default to using that neural wiring pattern on autopilot is the third step. As soon as if you can learn to interrupt it, you can pretty much change anything.
Oh, amazing. So then again, it's the matter of just repeating itself enough times that the brain recognizes it and just solidifies it in terms of those neuron creation. Is that it?
It is, to an extent. Repetition's part of it, but also you've got like I said, the emotional weight, that the risk. You've got risk reward assessment going on all the time. So your brain is a prediction machine. It's always predicting, whether it's milliseconds ahead, and what word I'm going to say, and you probably said next in your head, because that's how fast your brain's working. To all the way out to seconds, minutes, days, hours, weeks, months, years, right? And end of lifetime. We're always thinking, if I do this now, does it suit my prediction of me being safe in the next 15 minutes, 20 minutes, half hour, in my job role, in this company, etc., etc. So you've got that risk aspect. And if you think that the risk of being a hard-nosed businessman, now you've got new evidence, new science to prove that that's not going to get the best out of people, because they're emotional creatures too, is going to put you at more risk of judgment than from your peer group, or it's going to put you at risk of losing your job because you're deemed to be a bad manager, then you're going to change the way you do things. So there's an emotional weight into it as well, and it's all to do with being able to predict your own safety. Now, if society and the environment you work in rewards loud voices, banging tables, shouting at people and swearing, then you're going to keep doing it, because you'll be more at risk through stop doing it. So there's an environmental aspect, there's an emotional weighting aspect, there's a prediction aspect, and then there's the repetition on top of that once you've chosen to do something differently. Does that make sense?
It does, actually. And there's a statement or question here. Do you require outside help to challenge?
Hey, Dr. Rim, hello, mate. Yeah. I didn't know you was going to be on the call. Great to see you. I think no one, well, yes, it does. I mean, especially going back to, I mentioned my wife, her OCD tendencies have gone through the roof because estrogen's a neuromodulator. It regulates thinking capacity. So now she has some mild tendencies. They're really exacerbated right now, and she's struggling with it, and it's not nice to see at all. When you've got compulsive OCD tendencies, because that's the strong wiring pattern in your brain, then absolutely for sure getting somebody outside to help give you a program, help you check your own thinking is going to be of benefit. But the reality is no one can change our brain apart from us, and we do that with our own thinking. So we can create the conditions for other brains to respond in different ways, but it's still up to the individual to do the work, and it's not easy to become, going back to ancient wisdom. You go back to the ancient temple of Apollo in Delphi, the district sort of 20 miles outside of Athens, and the inscription there was "Know thyself." Right, that was thousands of years ago. That was written down, and we're still in the same situation. The more we can know ourselves, the more able we are to work with what we've got. And now neuroscience really unpacks the mechanism. So as far as I'm concerned, the more you know about your own brain function, the more you can accept yourself for who you are, the more you can understand that the way you feel right now and what you're going through is just biology. And therefore, if you understand that mechanism, you can work with it. And this is what I'm seeing, teaching this stuff to people all around the world. It's as soon as the mechanisms are understood and the patterns are understood, people are able to facilitate changing themselves that lasts so much faster than has ever been possible, because we just haven't had the science, so we haven't had the belief in the mechanism before. But yeah, Dr. M, just if you need help, then get it. But actually, the work comes down to doing it ourselves, really.
Yeah, amazing stuff. It just keeps me. I just keep thinking that so many of us used to think that habits are either biological or behavioral, and it's a mix of both. Is that true? It's not completely biological and it's not completely behavioral, but it's like you can use biology to shape that behavior and vice versa.
I think the interesting bit there is, Mina, is what is behavior if it's not an output of brain function?
Yeah.
So if you have to put it in an order, then you've got, and again, going back to this model, this is why we designed the model, it makes it easy to understand. You've got a wiring pattern in your brain, all those neurons that we saw growing in that Petri dish. And there's 86 billion of those in our brain, with up to 10,000 branches on each one. So you've got up to 860 trillion connections in your head, And so that's what we call a belief or a value or a principle. It's a wiring pattern. It has to be, because there's nowhere else it exists. It doesn't exist in your elbow or your knee or your stomach. It's in your brain. The way that your brain processes things is by reaching action potential in each neuron, which means it gets an electrical charge and depolarizes it. So whenever we think of anything, that's the wiring firing. And the output of that is a signal that gets sent from your central nervous system to your peripheral nervous system, and your muscles move and you move. So behavior and what you say and how you blink your eyes or whatever you do is an output of brain function. But there's a chemical component to it, which is all the neurotransmitters that have to jump from one of those neurons to the next. So there has to be an emotional aspect to anything we do. So, and it weighs risk all the time. So if we choose to walk towards something or away from it, our brain's only going to trigger our muscles to move towards or away from based on the assessment that requires a chemical aspect to make that analogy, that assessment. Repeating myself, but that's action, right? That's behavior. That's output. So when we say behavioral, there's has to be every aspect of our behavior is biological, and that biology's got a process. And the beauty is we can now understand the process. So if we see what's going on the outside, even if it's when we're looking in the mirror and we don't like what we see, then we know we've got full agency to do something about it.
I like that. I like full agency. One quick question before we leave. I'm just going to take advantage of that 1 minute left. So I remember we had this conversation when you were in Cambridge, and that was so inspiring to me because I was telling you about functioning under stress and ask you if I need to change this because it puts a lot of pressure on me. But on the other hand, I just perform really well. And right now in the presentation, you mentioned something about the brain kind of works faster or internalizes that habit a bit faster when under stress or under pressure. So I want to ask, is this good stress? Is it helpful? Is it okay if we keep functioning or putting pressure on ourselves under stressful circumstances to achieve something? Or no, it's down the line in the long term, it's not that of a good idea.
So there's two different types of stress, basically. Eustress, which is good stress, and chronic stress, which is bad stress. And eustress means fleeting, so we've got a thing called the HPA axis, the hypothalamus, the pituitary gland, which is two parts of the brain, and the adrenal glands, which sit on top of our kidneys, right? Now, we know that the adrenal glands excrete cortisol and adrenaline. So adrenaline is that, quick, immediate response, heart rate changes, pupils dilate, take more in, etc., etc. But it takes all the glucose energy away from the prefrontal cortex, but it keeps us safe. So if something bangs on a machine, you're going to run straight away because you're going to get that response. And that whole mechanism is going to cut in milliseconds to give you that capacity to survive. And historically, you can think about, hearing a rustle in the grass and assuming it might be a tiger. So you run before you've even thought what it might be. That keeps you safe. So there's but the point is, cortisol comes along, your brain then assesses the situation, and the cortisol is the stressor hormone that usually hits your brain within about a minute of the initial shock, and then that starts to make sure that your brain is in this constant state of moving glucose energy away from the prefrontal cortex, activating the amygdala and that response system. And that's good as long as it lasts a short while, and then you return back to homeostasis and your chemical balance goes back to normal. The problem we've got in the world today is that we've got all the apps on our phones, we've got all of our inboxes overflowing, we've got 35 tabs open on our browsers because we're using AI and LinkedIn and Instagram and WhatsApp and whatever else. We've got all the noise of traffic, we've got everything around us, we've got the boss coming down on us, we've got KPIs from the system, we've got all these different things, and we're constantly chronically stressed. Now, what that does is it kills cells. Too much cortisol in your system links to chronic heart disease, right? People die of heart disease in their 50s if they've lived 20 or 30 years of stressful life in their work. So it's proven, it's biological, it's medical, we know it. So the more we are stressed on a chronic basis, the worse it is for us. That said, when we talk about neurodivergence, I think the problem we've got in the world is that neurotypical is way too narrow. So, and when you look at the spread, actually there's more people that are sort of more left brain myelinated and more right brain myelinated axon density than there is the people in the middle. So we've got a society that rewards a very narrow range of us all on a much broader spectrum, which is still normal. Now, some people with sort of right brain myelinated tendencies, ADHD type tendencies that work with just thinking. One of the other personality traits that comes with that is leaving things till the last minute, because there's a lack of dopamine response process that allows you to not really be motivated to do anything until your time's nearly up. So you leave things till the last minute and then you knock it out of the park if you've got a brain that's wired that way. And that's perfectly okay. What's wrong with that? As long as you still get the work done, there's nothing wrong with it if it works for the individual. Other people are completely the opposite end of the scale. So it's easily to understand neurologically. It's no longer subjective, but there is a wider range of ways people can get the best from their brains that we have to start embracing and accepting across society. Because at the moment, the structure rewards too narrow a section of society and makes everybody else wrong. And a lot of people grow up feeling like they don't fit, that they're not right in the world. And that's horrible. Why would we want people to feel like that when they've just got a brain that's genetically predisposed to, work in different ways, and they can still produce very good outputs, So we've got to think about it through a different lens, I think. And the more we know about neuroscience, the easier that becomes.
Amazing. I gotta say, it really calms me down to know this. So I'm just wired differently with them. Thank you again, David, for accepting my invitation. It's been a real pleasure.
And well, thank you for entertaining me with so much extra time. So I'm sorry I didn't manage to stick to your original time slot. And thanks to anybody that stayed with us as well. It's much appreciated.
Thank you, everyone who joined us. Thanks again, and have a good rest of the day.
Bye. See you soon. Ta-da.